Next slide.
Yes, thank you. So before we get into our first session, let's quickly go over some house rules to ensure that we all have a smooth and productive learning experience over these next 2 days. So first, we just ask if you have a question or you'd like to participate, please use the virtual hand raise or chat feature. Just so you're aware, we will have dedicated Q&A portions at the end of each session to address any additional questions that you may have. And we also ask that you just mute yourself to minimize any disruptions. Please keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking. And then additionally, as we said earlier, just please be aware that our sessions will be recorded for this training and documentation purposes. So by participating, you are consenting to being recorded. Also, please use the chat responsibly. It's there for any relevant questions, comments, or interactions that you have, but please avoid sharing any personal information. Also, camera on is optional. Our facilitators will have their cameras on, but please feel free to do whatever is most comfortable for you. And then lastly, technical issues. If you encounter any technical issues, please reach out to your own technical support team for assistance. Okay, so before we move forward, we wanted to make sure that this is a collaborative effort. If anyone has any additional house rules that you'd like to propose, please share them in the chat, and because we really value your input. So I'll take a moment just in case anybody has any additional rules they like to put in. And if not, we just want to also make sure that everybody is in agreement with these rules. So if you can either use the thumbs up reaction, or you can either put yes or no in the chat if you are concerned with any of these. So I see a thumbs up. That's a great sign. That's you. Okay. All right, so I'll assume that everyone is okay with these. So with this in mind, let's get started with our agenda for this session. In our first session today, we will provide some information about us as the facilitators and our background in this work. We'll also provide some background information on accelerating support to advanced local partners, or ASAP for short. We'll also tell you a little bit more about this training course, as well as we'll review the training schedule so you know exactly what to expect. And then lastly, we'll finish the session with an introduction activity. So now we'll move on to introducing ourselves. Catherine?
Thanks, Kayla. Another house rule that I was considering putting in, but I think it goes without saying, have fun. Great, thanks, Kayla. So good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Grausavaleda. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have, I'm a manager in Deloitte's Inclusive Economic Growth practice. I hold a master's degree in international relations and economics, and I have over 12 years of experience in capacity development, performance management, M&E, financial management, and program design and implementation. And I've spent a good chunk of my career working with institutions like USAID, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and several other development partners to help them enhance service delivery and oversee and support the execution of various PFM reforms across some 15 countries. I am co-facilitating this training with my colleague, Kayla Smith. I'll hand it over to her so she can introduce herself.
Yes, thank you. So yes, my name is Kayla Smith. My pronouns are also she and her as well. I'm a senior consultant in Deloitte's Human Capital portfolio, and I hold a master's in industrial organizational psychology from University of Maryland, College Park. I also have my bachelor's in family studies and community development. And specifically, I specialize in organizational design, strategic communications, learning, and change management. But for this training, I'm leveraging my extensive financial management skills from a 5-year tenure as a senior financial analyst prior to Deloitte. And I also have an 8-year background in wellness, nonprofit, and public health fields. So I really bring a holistic approach to this work in organizational strategy and design and transformation. So we're truly excited to engage in this training with you all today. So now we're going to transition into some more background context for the training.
Thanks. So as we mentioned in the beginning, this training is being hosted by Accelerating Support to Advanced Local Partners, or ASAP for short. The ASAP project was started in 2019 and last year was extended into 2024 under the moniker ASAP 2. And this project operates as a consortium led by IntraHealth International, with subcontractors including Deloitte Consulting, of which Kayla and I are both employees. And ASAP's purpose is clear. It's all about rapidly preparing local organizations and governments, referred to as local partners, to serve as prime partners for USAID's, US President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, as I'm sure you are all very familiar with, and their programming across the African continent. And the strategic objectives behind ASAP are also equally clear. Really, it's all aiming at strengthening local partners. And through this technical assistance that the project provides to local organizations in key areas like audit readiness, internal controls, whistleblower and anti-fraud procedures, human resources, and more, ASAP 2 is contributing significantly to USAID's broader objective to provide 70% of its PEPFAR funding to local prime partners by 2025, which, if you can believe, is just next year. I still can't believe it. Next, we'll look a little bit more into PEPFAR and provide some context around that important program. Thanks. First, PEPFAR was originally launched in 2003 with the mission to deliver life-saving efforts in countries hardest hit by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. It's important to note that PEPFAR is led and managed by the United States Department of State's Office of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and Health Diplomacy, which really just underscores the country's high-level commitment to supporting resolution on this critical cause. And PEPFAR is not a standalone initiative. Rather, it's really a shining example of interagency collaboration. There are 7 U.S. government departments and agencies that work together through PEPFAR to control the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And this whole of government approach is really just a testament to the united effort put forth to combat this disease. And working alongside partners in more than 50 countries, PEPFAR's impact has truly been remarkable. It has saved more than 25 million lives and prevented millions of HIV infections. And to put this a little bit more sharply into perspective, when PEPFAR initiated its efforts, only some 50,000 individuals across sub-Saharan Africa were receiving treatment, whereas today we know that more than 20 million men, women, and children are receiving this life-saving care. And this really speaks volumes about the program's transformative impact on the continent. And in September of 2022, PEPFAR has supported, as of September 2022 rather, PEPFAR had supported 20 countries in achieving epidemic control of HIV, or reaching UNAIDS 90-90-90 HIV treatment targets. And these accomplishments are instrumental, really, in advancing global progress towards achieving the UN's SDG of ending the AIDS epidemic as a public health threat by 2030. And these are just some of the remarkable accomplishments highlighted on this slide, which illustrate the profound impact of PEPFAR's work on global health. And PEPFAR's mission has evolved over the years. In addition to its core focus on HIV/AIDS, it has also played a pivotal role in aiding COVID-19 responses globally. And going forward, PEPFAR will continue to leverage its experience and resources to enhance countries' readiness for future emergencies and global health challenges. And this adaptive approach is really just hallmark of the program's overall success. So now let's pivot quickly to discussing how PEPFAR aligns with our focus on public financial management, which is what we're here to talk about. So the ASAP program is inextricably linked with PEPFAR. And this link is established by ASAP's 2 main objectives, which are listed again here on the slide. And in the pursuit of these objectives, ASAP envisions technical assistance to its local partners in the following forms. 1, to strengthen financial management systems and compliance. 2, to help strengthen organizational capacity. And 3, to help strengthen program management and monitoring and evaluation systems. So in essence, these areas of technical assistance ensure that our partners are not only well equipped, but also fully aligned with the standards and requirements of PEPFAR. And building on all of this is ASAP's commitment to continuous education, knowledge, and sharing, especially in the topics that I just mentioned, which is part of what we are all here today to do. So let's continue and take a closer look at what this course outline will look like, and we can tell you about our experience over the next 2 days. Kayla?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Okay, so here we have a quick overview of the course. Our main purpose is to strengthen your knowledge on the fundamentals and building blocks of public financial management, or PFM, as you'll see throughout the presentation. And really, its importance for promoting effective management of public resources, good governance, and accountable delivery of public services. By the end of this training, our goal is really to equip you with the foundational skills needed to build both effective and accountable PFM systems. We're also focused on how the COVID-19 pandemic has brought about both challenges and opportunities to transform PFM systems, especially in the healthcare sector. So throughout this course, we'll work on 4 specific objectives. First, we want to make sure that we improve your understanding of PFM principles. This will include discussions about fiscal policy objectives, such as revenue and expenditures, and also their understanding of the budget as a strategic policy tool. We'll also look at all of the close connections between PFM and accountability and why they're both important for the effective management of public resources and the delivery of public services. We'll specifically address the challenges brought on by COVID-19, as I mentioned before, and help you recognize the different opportunities to transform PFM systems. And finally, we want to really inspire you to promote PFM system transformation and reform within your own work. So our training is going to take place over the next 2 days, with each day lasting for 3 hours. So in total, this will be 6 hours of e-learning. You'll also receive the PowerPoint presentations that include all of the resources and references used for this training. So really, we're here to empower you with your own knowledge and skills needed to improve public financial management. So let's make the most of our opportunity today and tomorrow. We'll review the schedule for the next 2 days. So today, on day 1, we'll focus on 4 fundamental sessions. So the first being an introduction and general interview, which is what we're doing right now. And then next, we'll talk about the overview of PFM and fiscal policy, efficient domestic resource mobilization, as well as the budget as a strategic policy tool. And we'll also have a short break in between. And then tomorrow for day 2, we'll build upon the learning from day 1 with 4 additional sessions. First, we'll have providing goods and services through budget execution. Then we'll talk about audit, fiscal transparency, and accountability. And then PFM modernization and reform efforts. And then we'll finish with a course closure. There will also be another short break in between sessions 6 and 7, since they're a little bit longer. So our schedule is really designed to provide a comprehensive learning experience by allocating especially time for interaction and breaks. But if you have any questions or need any assistance, please feel free to reach out in the chat. So we'll move along and get started. So we'd like to start things off with the world map activity to learn where everyone is joining in from. It's a great way to connect and just see the diversity of our group and who we have today. So you can use the annotation feature to mark your location. I can walk you through the instructions for anyone that's unfamiliar with this tool. So first, if you look at the toolbar on your Zoom screen, it should be at the top. You can locate the annotate button. It looks like a little pencil or pen. So once you click on that, it'll open a toolbar to the left side of your screen. And then from there, you can click on the stamp feature, or if you prefer, you can use the pencil feature and just circle where. But the stamp usually starts off with like a check mark. So once you click that, you can change it however you like. I like the star one. And then once you have that, you can move it over to the map here and just click where you are joining us from. So I'll give you all a couple minutes to just mark on the screen. And I think you can also change the color, which is nice too. Add more. And if you're having any trouble, feel free to, you can either come off mute or ask in the chat. So Liberia. Beautiful. So,
And since Kayla and I
yes.
didn't say this in the beginning, she and I are joining you guys
Oh,
from Washington, D.C. So our location is not on this map.
thank you.
But in case you were curious, that's where we are.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Okay, that's wonderful. But we're still also very happy to have you all here, and we're excited to hear more from you. So this has been very helpful. So as we finish, we'll move along to our next slide. Oh, actually, let me shift because we actually do have a poll just to gather a little bit more insight. So I'll launch that poll now so that you all can
Yay, we have
participate.
another
It's really
participant in
easy.
Senegal.
Oh, yay. Oh, thank you. I didn't see.
And we have
Oh, in
Namibia
Namibia.
and Mozambique. There they are.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, just so you guys know, we will be using the annotate function periodically throughout this course. So this was just a warm-up.
Yes. So I did launch the poll. It's multiple choice, so pretty easy for y'all to fill out. Just 3 questions, and it'll really just help us to learn more about you so that we can tailor this training a little bit more towards your sectors.
Wow, everyone's in the government public sector. Is anybody representing USAID or a donor? Maybe not. Okay, well,
Which is nice.
welcome. Oh, other. We have an okay.
I'm interested in other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, uh, yes,
Oh,
here,
USAID
USAID
Senegal.
Senegal. Okay.
Awesome.
For the person that put other, you could either come off mute or put in the chat what your organization is. That would be great.
Mhm. Looks like majority of you all have been in your role for 2 to 5 years, but we also have 10 to 15, which is amazing, and 1 to 2 years. And it seems as though familiar with PFM, public financial management, mixed in between some familiar, neutral, not as familiar, which is great. So I think this will be really helpful. Okay, so oh, and 1 donor. Lovely. So actually, I will just go ahead and share those results so you can see them. Yeah. Okay, there we go. All right, so we'll on moving forward. So as we finish this session, I just wanted to go over a few key takeaways, but let me clear those up for you. Okay. So first, as Catherine stated, ASAP 2 plays an important role in helping USAID achieve its goal of providing 70% of its PEPFAR funding to local prime partners by 2025. And this is being achieved through technical assistance and support provided to local organizations. We also know that the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, as you know, we're all familiar with, is a global initiative that works with partners in more than 50 countries and has saved over 25 million lives and prevented millions, of HIV infections. And then finally, we also learned in this session that governments and organizations with strong public financial management capacity are better equipped to manage PEPFAR funding effectively. To really summarize, the work that we do here has a direct and positive impact on lives of millions of people. So our intention for this training is really to equip you with the foundational skills required to build effective and accountable PFM systems. So always want to remember that your knowledge and skills are really essential for promoting good governance and the delivery of critical public services. So now, like I mentioned earlier, we'll take just a couple minutes if you have any questions or you want to share any thoughts on anything. You feel free to ask us anything now or during the whole training. Okay. So hearing none, we'll move on. But again, feel free at any point, feel free to ask us any questions. So as we conclude each session, we will provide the references and resources that we use so that if you need them, you can go back and deeper any kind of learning or knowledge that you want to get. And all the references are linked for easier access in the presentation. So this concludes session 1. We'll move on to session 2, which is overview of PFM and fiscal policy. Welcome to session 2 of our training. We're already there. So here we're going to be discussing PFM and fiscal policy, as I said, and really providing an overview of effective resource management and governance. So in this session, we'll begin by understanding what fiscal policy entails. Then we'll talk about what PFM is. After that, we'll discuss the linkages between PFM and fiscal policy. And then lastly, we'll finish with some PFM resources. So moving on to our objectives. In this session, you will gain valuable insights into fiscal policy and understand its significance. Next, you'll also acquire knowledge about the key elements of PFM and understand its importance as well. We'll articulate the link between fiscal policy and PFM, as I mentioned. And then lastly, you'll be able to identify and access relevant PFM resources to support your ongoing learning and development. So with that, we'll get started with our first topic, which is what is fiscal policy with Catherine.
Thanks, Kayla. So today we begin by introducing this fundamental concept of fiscal policy. In essence, fiscal policy is the strategic use of government spending and revenue to influence the broader economy. And governments employ fiscal policy to promote strong, sustainable economic growth, as well as to reduce poverty. And fiscal policy encompasses 2 key aspects. The first of these is revenue, or tax policy. So what is it? So revenue policy is how societies carry out taxation, including funds collected from taxes on income and profits. It is critically important, of course, as the national tax system generates revenues to fund government expenditures and deliver essential public services. And there are 2 types of taxes. Direct taxes, such as taxes on income and wealth, and indirect taxes on things like consumption. And the second aspect of fiscal policy is the expenditure side. And this involves how governments decide what to do and at what level, as well as the most efficient methods for producing said outputs and delivering them to the public. And expenditure policy is important because it plays a pivotal role in delivering public services, in ensuring that consumer goods are available, in investments, and ultimately in income redistribution. Governments can use expenditure to stimulate economic growth, for example, by increasing demand for productive public goods. And just like tax policy can be broken down into some subgroups, expenditure items can also be categorized in various ways, such as by economic classification, so things like salaries, goods, services, transfers, capital spending, or by function, like health, education, dispense, and other administrative categories. So let's take a look at some graphs to understand how revenue and expenditure have behaved over time globally. Thanks, Kayla. So the graph before you illustrates these trends as a percentage of GDP from 2005 all the way to 2021. And the revenue line, which is that blue one, which by the way excludes grants, hovers within this range of about 22% to about 24% up until 2019. And then it experiences an increase up to a little bit more than 26% by 2021, after, of course, an initial dip in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, the expense line, which is in red, you do see follows a similar trajectory, right? Ranging from about 25% all the way up to almost 29% in 2019, and then surging dramatically to 34% in 2020. This obviously reflects the substantial financial response that countries provided during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in general, what we see from this graph is that globally governments tend to spend more than they take in. And this graph becomes, and the gap between spending and expenditure becomes more acute, as you'll see, around periods of economic uncertainty. So obviously beyond the large gap that we see in revenue and expenditure during the COVID-19 period, which I think we all remember very acutely, we also see a widening gap around the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis as well. And ultimately, this data underscores the significant fiscal adjustments made by governments in response to both immediate crises as well as long-term financial goals and fiscal sustainability. Next slide. So moving into the realm of health expenditure, this graph shows here us some insights on health expenditure starting from the year 2000 all the way to 2020. And on the left side of the graph, which is in current US dollars, this indicates that current health expenditure per capita in current US dollars has displayed a steady increase over time, from about $475 in 2000 to almost $1,200 by 2020. And beyond the need to respond to COVID, which of course is very important, this secular trend highlights the increasing financial commitment to healthcare on an individual basis, as well as the overall rising healthcare costs that we've seen over the last 2 decades. And the other side of the graph illustrates current health expenditure as a percentage of GDP. And in 2002, it was about 25% of GDP, and we observe a significant leap all the way to beyond 30% in 2020, albeit with some leveling off in the years leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this increase also reflects the growing importance of healthcare within national budgets and economies, and particularly in the face of multiple public health challenges that we have experienced over the last 2 decades. Excuse me. Now, during our time together, we will continue to return to this issue or to issues related to health and expenditure, particularly in terms of how they relate to PFM concepts, as well as the management of our most recent and significant health crisis, which is COVID-19. But we wanted first to just provide you with this initial context for how revenue and expenditure, but particularly in the health sector, interact over time and affect global events. And as you can hear from my voice, I am also getting over a cold. Hope it doesn't bother you guys too much if I cough occasionally. One of the benefits of getting to do this remotely is that I can be in my safe bubble over here and still provide this training experience to you all. So Next slide.
Yes. Yeah. I hope everybody is healthy. Um, so before we talk about what PFM is, we want to get your initial thoughts and impressions with the word cloud activity. So we'll walk you through the instructions for this as well. First, we'll share our screen to display the word cloud platform so you can see it, but there'll be a link in the chat. I think Vui is going to send it over. And then once you have that link, you can click on it and it'll take you to a page where you can input your word or phrase. So the question we want to know or request is that you think of a word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of public financial management. There should be 3 different boxes, but you can fill in one, all 3, however you like. And then once you're done with that, you can hit submit. And then once everybody submits their words, we'll be able to see the word cloud evolve in real time. So the size of each word reflects the frequency of the word or phrase used. So the more people use it, the bigger the word or phrase will look. So I think it gives us a good snapshot of the key perceptions that we have surrounding around PFM. And it's also just a fun way to see how our different thoughts both align and differ. So I know we're gonna have the link in the chat for you in just a moment.
And just a caveat, Kayla was right. There's spaces for you guys to write in 3 different words or phrases, but you can only submit once. I made this mistake yesterday when we test drove this. So if you think you have other words, more than just one, just make sure that you submit, you fill out all the boxes.
Yes.
Sharon or Vui, do we have the link?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I see. Thank you, Sharon, for the code. Do you have the link? It should be it should be a copy link as well. I don't think yet. Thank you. Um, I think I can see. Oh, thank you, Sharon. So yes, so the link should be in the chat now. And like Catherine said, once you click on it, it'll give you 3 boxes. Only can submit once, so just be aware. That's fine. Um, anything else or any other thoughts, you can also feel free to put it in the chat as well. And then we will also switch over to Hui or Sharon to show the word cloud activity so you all can see.
Can I share my screen, Kyla?
Yes, you may. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Now up and running with the colors. So control, tough, efficient, transparency, investment, consistent, accountability. Mhm. Oh, very in alignment. So accountability, slave resource allocation, absolutely. Universal coverage. Mm, it- Okay, I'll give it another just a minute. Anybody else has any other words or phrases they'd like to share? Good. Awesome. Yeah, so all of these, I think we're going to touch on in some aspects. So everybody is right on course, right on par.
A lot of these are great. Oh, it's changing again. Yay.
Yes.
Underspend, overspend, management of funds. I love whoever put tough.
Mm,
I think, definitely complex, right? Every country has well, there's, obviously unifying leading PFM practices. Every country's PFM system is to some degree very bespoke to their own legal and institutional arrangements. And that certainly makes being a PFM specialist or practitioner an interesting challenge. But I couldn't agree more that, a lot of these other themes that we're seeing are things that we're going to be covering more and more, as we move along in this course. And hopefully, not that after this course, the PFM system will stop being tough, but hopefully this course will just help provide a little bit more foundation for understanding certain aspects and helping to grapple some of the more intricate, complex elements of the system in general. But certainly other things that we're seeing like transparency, accountability, efficiency, consistency, where do we see universal coverage? Those are all really important aspects that we're going to be talking about. Resource all of this is great. Kayla, I'll give it over to
mhm.
you to bring this exercise home.
Oh, yeah, yes. No, but thank you for that. Exactly what I was thinking in my head. Sometimes it's really get there. But yeah, I 100% agree. So we will switch back. Thank you, Sharon.
Can we take a screenshot of that before
Oh,
we delete it though?
yeah.
I'll take a screenshot and I'll also share it with you, Kayla and Catherine.
Great, thanks, Sharon.
Wonderful. All right. Switching back here. You all can see that. Okay. Yeah. So moving forward, we'll talk about what is PFM.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So yes, this is the question of the day. What is PFM? And in essence, PFM encompasses a comprehensive system, including the mobilization of revenue, as well as the allocation to and spending of resources by government ministries, departments, and agencies, or MDAs. And PFM also involves the accounting for and reporting on revenues and expenditures. So basically, it covers all of the components of a country's budget process. And just for general awareness, we will be using the term ministries, departments, and agencies, or MDAs, to refer to the ecosystem of spending units that carry out core PFM functions within each of your governments. And we'll be using this term throughout the course. So just know that that's what that is. And to understand PFM better, we wanted to first break it down for you a little bit into its primary objectives. And some of these, we just saw it appear in the word cloud. So hopefully these objectives resonate with your own experiences with PFM. And these objectives are really critical for pursuing a sound financial management system. And the first of these is fiscal discipline, right? This represents the government's ability to control budget totals by setting ceilings on expenditures. And these limits or ceilings are binding at both the aggregate level and for the individual MDAs. The next primary objective is allocative efficiency. And allocative efficiency reflects the government's ability to allocate resources through the budget in line with government priorities. This allocation really should be based on program fiscal and operational efficiency. And governments should have the flexibility to reallocate from old priorities to new ones, or from less to more efficient programs and activities, all of course in accordance with their government's strategic priorities. And lastly, the third objective of PFM is operational efficiency, otherwise known as the efficiency in the delivery of public services. And operational efficiency signifies that the government has the ability to implement programs at the lowest cost while still maintaining a desired level of service quality. And understanding these primary objectives is essential for effective public financial management, as these are really the cornerstone of fiscal responsibility. Let's continue to explore some of the different components of PFM on the upcoming slide. Great, thanks, Kayla. So these elements of a PFM system form the framework for our training that we're going to have over the next 2 days. Our training is divided up into the major components of PFM, which speak to the core PFM functions and areas where PFM demonstrates impact. And these key elements represent the foundation of effective financial management. And we'll walk through this graphic, but they include, firstly, revenue via domestic resource mobilization in order to fund essential public services, goods, and works. Next, we have budget via budget planning and preparation. And this includes, strong government strategic planning and development of a credible medium-term fiscal framework, which all fuel sound budget practices. Next element is budget execution. So here we mean how the government manages resources, its cash, procurement, debt for delivering goods and services, and then accounts for those transactions over time. And then we also have oversight, which occurs through control and audit and fiscal transparency. So this represents all the institutional arrangements that are in place to reduce risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. For example, through the implementation of a sound internal controls environment and a robust internal and external audit function, as well as the involvement of citizens more broadly to promote government accountability. And all of these elements are interconnected through various reporting requirements, which is a key aspect of PFM as well. And these elements are underscored by laws, policies, and regulations from each country that provide the PFM system with its mandate and governs the way that it is set up and operates. And all of this is also underscored by continuous improvement and PFM reform efforts that seek to strengthen effectiveness, efficiency, and transparency within each of these PFM elements. And throughout this training, we'll continue to dive deeper into each of these elements to understand how they work together within the PFM framework. And while we do not have time to explore all aspects of each of these elements, as this would take many days to do just even a cursory level survey of these topics, by the end of this training, you should have a foundational grasp of these key elements, how they connect, and their significance in PFM. Next slide, thanks. So in PFM, there is a diverse set of stakeholders, each with a critical role to play in the effective operation of the financial management system. As we begin, it's essential to recognize and understand these stakeholders, as their interconnections are key to a well-functioning PFM framework. And some of the main stakeholders are listed here, although there are many others. This is not an exhaustive list, but let's talk through a few of these stakeholders just for better understanding. First, we have the Ministry of Finance and Planning, and this MDA is often at the heart of PFM. as they're responsible for fiscal policy, for budgeting, and for financial management functions. We also have subnational government bodies, right? PFM doesn't just
Okay, sorry, I just want to make sure, is it just me or Catherine Freeze? I think she just popped off.
Catherine, we can't hear you.
Okay, then it wasn't just me. No worries. I think she'll join in shortly. Let's see. I'll just hold on one more moment. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. Well, I will just pick up until make sure Catherine joins back on. But yeah, so we mentioned there's all government MDAs. I also have the central bank, which manages monetary policy and can influence financial stability. We also have the legislature that enacts budgets and financial laws and provides oversight and scrutiny into the PFM system. So very important. We have non-governmental organizations, which often are involved in advocacy, monitoring, and supporting good governance. The media especially also plays a role in raising awareness and also holding governments accountable and shaping public opinion. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we have citizens. So, everyone like us, um, who are basically what all this is for, right? So we all pay taxes, we receive goods, services, and works that are products of how the PFM system operates, and we demand transparency and accountability in how these are delivered. So all these stakeholders work in tandem within a complex web of interactions, really that make up PFM as a multi-dimensional ecosystem. And participation of each of these is crucial to achieving effective financial management and good governance in our respective countries. So as we progress through this training, we'll dive deeper into how these stakeholders actually collaborate and create a robust PFM system. So I wanted to highlight here, so when we think about PFM systems, it really is about laws and regulations and the various stakeholders within it, like we just discussed. So how do you know if you actually are in a strong PFM system? To answer that, there are 6 key characteristics that we found to define a sound PFM system globally. So the first being budget credibility. First, budget credibility, excuse me, hinges on the realism of budget and whether it's implemented as intended. There's also comprehensiveness and transparency. So this is barely where it's a characteristic that emphasizes the need for comprehensive budget and fiscal risk oversight and public disclosure. Third, we have found that policy-based budgeting is also a meaningful characteristic. And by this, we mean that the budget is prepared with due regard to government policies and priorities. There's also budget predictability. And really, this ensures that the budget is implemented predictably and it enables sound investment decisions. Next, we also have a sound, make sure that there is a sound PFM system, has adequate records and information that is produced, maintained, and disseminated to government bodies and the public, which is really important. And then lastly, having a meaningful scrutiny and audit process. So By this, we mean that effective mechanisms for scrutiny of public finances and follow-ups of those audit findings are really crucial. And this really involves participation of legislature and the executive branch in overseeing and improving PFM systems. So now when we think about your own PFM systems, I ask that you consider looking through it through this lens of these characteristics, and then you'll really get a good sense of where improvements and reform efforts should be targeted. So now that we've explored the fundamental components of PFM and fiscal policy, we really want to make sure that you all understand how these two elements interact in practice. Oh, sorry, I will just say there's a question. Are these characteristics taken assessed regardless whether the government has allocated enough resources for health in the first place? Good point. I'd say yes, with some caveats, right? If there aren't enough resources for health in the first place, then that's a clear indicator of an area that needs to be assessed and then supported. So sometimes it can look like, we can't have one without the other. But at least it's a great way to at least understand where to start, if that makes sense. So then here we have, like I was saying, the fundamental components of PFM and fiscal policy. So I think this sort of image here helps to understand how they interact in practice. So fiscal policy is the design part. It's what basically sets the what to do. And PFM can be thought of as the implementation part. So PFM is the how to do, if not what. And it really provides a means to implement fiscal policy effectively. So if the objective in this context is to achieve a sustainable fiscal position, fiscal policy involves determining what, in this case, the desired level of debt and establishing overarching financial policy goals. And then, whereas PFM systems are concerned with the how of implementing fiscal policy, that ensures sustainability, fiscal space, and accountability. And then really to achieve our objective, the desired level of debt is established by the fiscal policy, and the government might adopt an expenditure, rule and implement it in steps like shown in the red there, those 3 steps. So we have development of a medium-term framework, and this really involves a structured approach to budgeting and planning. And then we also have the link the rule to the budget process, right? So this ensures that budget decisions align with fiscal policy goals. It's really important. And then lastly, we have implementing reporting and monitoring requirements. And these are really helpful for tracking progress and ensuring accountability. So again, in essence, fiscal policy outlines the what needs to be achieved, while PFM provides the how in terms of designing and implementing policies effectively. Oh, hi, Catherine.
Thank you guys for continuing. So, certainly one of the benefits of being virtual is that I can still be sick and provide this training. One of the downsides is that shenanigans like this can happen. So this is why you have a co-facilitator. That's all I can say. So thanks, Kayla. Glad that you guys carried on without me while I was sorting out my computer. It just totally froze and shut down. I don't know what that was about.
No worries.
Anyway, thanks. So as we've mentioned on previous slides, a 2-day training of this size is really not sufficient to transform you all into PFM experts, which is why the awareness of and access to relevant resources is so crucial for ongoing learning and professional development in PFM. And here on the slide are some valuable resources at your disposal, ranging from things like guides and assessments to literature, trainings, blogs, especially from credible organizations in the space like the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, USAID, and other professional organizations like ICGFM. And these resources offer a wealth of knowledge and insight to support your journey in PFM. And we have an example of one of these resources on the next slide I wanted to highlight for you. So one of my favorite PFM resources is the Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Assessment, or PIFA, as you may know it as. And one of their many resources worth highlighting is the 2022 PIFA Global Report on PFM, which draws on over 2 decades of assessments across 145 countries, including their own reflections on the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I won't go through all of their key findings here for the sake of time. You can read them all. But one takeaway that I did want to highlight, because it's particularly aligned with our theme of PFM through COVID, is the last one. The PIFA Secretariat, in their assessment and their kind of gathering of lessons learned and reflections on COVID, did obviously find that non-competitive procurement methods are prevalent in several countries. Actually, they're prevalent in all countries. And this impacts the quality and efficiency of government expenditure. Obviously, in the advent of COVID-19, we globally saw a sharp increase in the use of these simplified procedures and emergency procurement processes, all of which, do of course play an important role in helping a country respond to a crisis promptly. But it's also important to recognize that they do create issues with transparency and value for money. And this is a topic we'll talk about a little bit later as well, but it's important to note that these findings from PIFA, whether it's their global report or any of their other specific bespoke reports on any country, do serve as a valuable resource for countries seeking to enhance their PFM systems, as the PIFA assessment is seen in the PFM space as a valuable benchmark. Next slide.
Thank you. So as we finish the session, we have a few takeaways. First, fiscal policy remains essential for sound financial management, ensuring economic stability and fostering recovery. Also, we learned that PFM's core objectives of fiscal discipline, efficient resource allocation, and efficient service delivery are essential for good governance. And really, a robust PFM system relies on both the close collaboration of various stakeholders to ensure effective financial operations. And then really now more than ever, promoting strong PFM systems is vital for informed decision-making and effective financial management. As we know, many organizations provide valuable research and expertise on these topics, which makes them really good resources and readily accessible to the public. So as you learn more about PFM and how to apply it in your own professional development, please know that you do have a wealth of resources and community of stakeholders to support you. So now we'll take just a moment if anybody does have any questions at this time, or if you want to share any thoughts or any insights that you may have gotten. All right. And just remember that feel free to reach out anytime. I know we had a question in the chat earlier, so that is perfectly fine and also helps us as well. So again, here, I just want to point out that we do have all the references linked at the end of each session. And that this concludes the end of session 2. So right now we'll move on right into session 3. Okay, so welcome to session 3.
And I did just want to say a quick welcome to the people that have joined recently.
Oh, yes.
My name is Catherine. This is Kayla. Welcome. Thanks for joining.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, and so for session 3, we're going to talk about efficient domestic resource mobilization, or DRM, as you will see shortened in the presentation. So efficient DRM is really a fundamental to a country's financial health. And then in this session, we'll discuss some of those key concepts and practices. Okay, so in this session, we'll start by understanding what DRM is and explore the distinctions between tax and non-tax revenue. Next, we'll discuss the characteristics that define a sound revenue system and examine the role of tax administration in that process. And then we'll finish with discussing the impact of COVID-19 on DRM. So going back to our framework for this training that Catherine went through earlier, you will see here that DRM and revenue really go hand in hand. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, but in summary, DRM involves modern and simple tax codes and laws that empower tax authorities, to improve collection practices. And really, in a lot of places around the world, it includes fiscal decentralization, which enables subnational governments to diversify their sources of income. And then really the ultimate goal of efficient and effective DRM practices is to allow governments to fund poverty reduction and public services. So right now we'll move on to our objectives for this session. By the end of the session, you will be able to understand what domestic resource mobilization, again, DRM, is and why it's important. You'll also understand the various ways in which governments generate revenue. And then lastly, we'll analyze the effects of COVID-19 on DRM and highlight that with some global trends. So then we'll get started with what is DRM.
Thanks, Kayla. So let's begin by understanding the essence of DRM. DRM is the process through which countries raise and spend their own funds to provide for their people. It's a crucial element of fiscal management that involves the generation of revenue from various sources, both tax and non-tax, to create fiscal space for sustainable budget expenditure. And DRM encompasses revenue generation from tax sources such as income, real estate, sales, VAT, as well as non-tax sources like user fees and permits. This broader revenue base supports service delivery, it promotes country ownership of investments, and over time reduces reliance on external assistance. The optimal level of DRM largely depends on a government's level of spending, certainly the country's economic context and other political considerations. And I also really wanted to highlight that DRM doesn't necessarily mean introducing new taxes or even raising taxes. Governments can enhance revenues simply by improving tax enforcement, by strengthening their audit capacity, or by simplifying their tax processes and code to promote compliance. And ultimately, DRM empowers governments with the funds that they need to reduce poverty and deliver essential public services, which are ultimately necessary for reducing dependence on aid. Next slide. Great. So as previously stated, it's essential to recognize that DRM encompasses more than just taxation. It includes any source of revenue available to fund government action. And this can range from fees on things like natural resource extraction or rents or tariffs or various levies on trade of goods. And it can also extend to developing local capital markets, which can lead to lower lending rates and greater access to local currency denominated bonds. Tax revenue and non-tax revenue are the two critical components of DRM that we recognize. Tax revenue is derived from charges on income earned and various tax revenue is derived from charges on income earned by the various individuals and entities. These are known as direct taxes. And the value of transactions in goods and services are other kinds of taxes that are charged, and those are known as indirect taxes. So those are taxes on consumption. So these taxes include direct and indirect taxes include income, real estate, sales, VAT, corporate tax, payroll, property, and the list goes on. Non-tax revenue is charged against services that are provided by the government. So examples include user fines and penalties and royalties. For example, the fee that you pay to renew your driver's license is an example of a non-tax revenue, or alternatively, the penalty that you would pay if you were late to renew your license as well is a non-tax revenue. And these revenue sources collectively contribute to DRM, enabling governments to fund their activities and foster economic and social development. So efficient domestic resource mobilization depends on the strength of revenue systems. To ensure optimal financial management, it's crucial for revenue systems to exhibit the following key characteristics. Firstly, revenue systems should generate sufficient revenue for the government. Revenue systems should provide this adequate level of funding in order to support government activities and public services. They should also be characterized as simple and easy to understand. Revenue systems should be straightforward and easily comprehensible to taxpayers. And certainly they should impose minimal compliance costs and seek to reduce administrative overhead expenses for the government. Third, revenue system should seek to limit economic distortions. Revenue systems should introduce minimal disruptions wherever possible to the economy to ensure smooth economic activities. They should also be stable. Strong revenue systems generate consistent and predictable revenue levels for the government, providing taxpayers with certainty in the rules and their obligations. And lastly, tax systems should be equitable. Revenue systems should distribute tax burden fairly amongst its tax base, as fairness fosters compliance. Taxpayers are more likely to adhere to a system that they perceive as equitable and fair. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not always possible to achieve all of these objectives simultaneously. For example, equity is sometimes achieved at the expense of simplicity. A law that properly defines a taxpayer's ability to pay might be more equitable, but it certainly does introduce a level of complexity into the tax code. However, well-functioning revenue systems around the world use these objectives as guiding principles for their strategy, policies, and day-to-day operations. So now let's learn a little bit more about the critical stakeholders in DRM, mostly the tax administration and their role in DRM. Thanks, Kayla. So the tax administration plays a pivotal role in the process of collecting taxes. This division of government is responsible for assuring efficient and effective collection. It can be part of the Ministry of Finance. It can be its own Ministry of Revenue, or it can be part of another competent MDA. Tax administrations today have three primary objectives. One, to enable and enhance voluntary compliance. Two, to monitor compliance and discover which taxpayers are not complying voluntarily. And three, to enforce compliance for those that are not complying voluntarily. And to do so, modern tax administrations typically perform the following core functions. First, they maintain a register of taxpayers. This helps keep a record of taxpayers and their respective obligations. They also produce revenue projections, and this enables governments to be able to forecast and plan for the intake of future tax revenue. Modern tax administrations also provide services to support and educate taxpayers. Tax administrations usually offer some level of guidance and assistance to taxpayers. A modern tax administration usually targets their support and information based on a taxpayer type or bracket. For example, corporations or large contributors tend to have more complex filings than lower income individuals, and therefore would need a different level of support in order to file their taxes correctly. Tax administrations also are in charge of processing tax declarations and payments. Tax administrations are responsible for the management of those submissions and for receiving the payments. They also are responsible for addressing taxpayer objections. Sometimes appeals happen, and the tax administration is responsible for working through those formal processes and addressing and adjudicating those appeals quickly. Similarly, the tax administration also is responsible for collecting taxes in arrears. Along with processing of timely filings, tax administrations also collect taxes that are overdue. Tax administrations are also perform functions regarding investigating fraud. Part of successfully collecting revenue means identifying and addressing tax fraud and evasion where it exists. And lastly, tax administrations also audit taxpayers. A tax administration should conduct routine audits to ensure compliance with tax laws and regulations. And modern tax administrations do this with a risk-based approach, which helps maximize the likelihood that if, for example, tax administration is dedicating time and resources to audit a specific taxpayer, that they're with a high likelihood both going to identify a problem and be able to collect revenue from that audit. And these functions collectively enable improved efficiency in tax collection, which are truly vital for effective DRM.
Thank you, Catherine. So we've talked a lot about introducing COVID-19 into our concept. So we do know that the COVID-19 pandemic presented some unique challenges to DRM. As countries work to understand the economic impact of the pandemic, DRM became even more important because governments needed revenue to provide both relief and programs to address economic and social issues caused by the pandemic. So in this section, we'll talk about the ways that COVID-19 has influenced DRM strategies and explore some measures that governments took as a result. Okay, so the graph here illustrates the revenue and expenditure trends as a percentage of GDP for different categories of economies. So here we have advanced, middle income, and low income over 2 decades, so from 2000 to 2022. And from this graph, we can see a few things. For one, similar to the global revenue and expenditure trends that we saw in the previous session, expenditures tend to outpace revenue over time, regardless of economy size. And there is a clear exception here in 2008 with the global financial crisis, where we can see that the lower and middle income countries collected more revenue than they spent. We can also see that countries experience a similar dip in revenues during COVID-19 because of situations where businesses weren't able to pay taxes. And as you know, people had to lower their spending in general. But however, after 2020, we do see a slow return to the revenue levels from previous years. So truly though, this data is a highlight of the significant fiscal challenges faced by governments globally during the pandemic. And as many countries exceeded their revenue generation in general with increased spending. So due to COVID-19, governments implemented different tax measures to address, like we were saying, both the economic and social impacts. These measures can be categorized into 3 different types. The first being relief measures. So the objective here is to cushion the economic and social impacts of the pandemic, which includes all measures like these listed below. But a couple to call out are tax filing extension, which extended the deadline for tax filings to ease administrative burdens. And then also we saw accelerated tax refunds, and that really expedited the process of tax refunds. So which helped ultimately bring more cash into the economy, right? And then another type of measure is stimulus and recovery oriented. The objective here is being able to stimulate an aggregated demand and investment. So this included things like tax incentives for employment, which provided tax incentives to promote job creation and also job retention, which is very important among others. And then lastly, here we have tax increases, which really aim to finance part of the government's response to the crisis. And this included actions like increasing top personal income tax rates and others. So these tax measures really reflect the diverse strategies that governments used of all economy sizes and income levels to manage the economic, fiscal, and social impacts of COVID-19. Yes, and so we also did find that there was an interesting shift in the focus of tax measures as well during COVID-19. So in the first half of 2020, when many countries were faced with lockdowns, as we know, the primary objective of tax measures was to provide immediate emergency relief to businesses and households alike. So, but however, as lockdowns began to ease up after the first initial wave of the pandemic, we saw countries that started to introduce recovery-oriented tax measures. So this shift in focus is reflected in the graph here, which shows the shares of countries supporting various tax measures across different country types. And it's really important to note that most country groups have maintained a combination of both relief and stimulus measures as they navigated ongoing challenges from the pandemic. So on this next slide, we want to invite you to participate in annotating the graph because we really want to know more about the tax measures from your respective countries, if you know of them. So our first question is, which common tax measure did your country utilize as part of COVID-19 response? And as a reminder, you can use the annotate feature. It should be at the top of your screen. The little pen, you can click that, and then it'll pop up on the left-hand side as well. So you can either use the pen feature or the stamp, however is easiest for you. And either you can circle which tax measure your country would have used, or you can put a stamp. So we have tax incentives for investments.
And Kayla, can you remind people
Yes.
What CTI payment deferrals are? Maybe go back to the previous slide
Yeah,
quickly.
let me go back. Oh, sorry, one moment.
Not concluding remarks.
I'm not concluding. Not there yet. Yes, sorry about that. So CIT or corporate income tax, and a reminder that VAT payment deferrals is actually value added tax reductions. Yes, thank you.
And for those of you that weren't here for our first annotate exercise, at the top, there's a view options drop-down menu. Go there. Oops, I didn't mean to annotate that.
Okay.
And you should be able to find the annotate function there.
So yes, corporate income
And what's
tax.
PIT, Kayla? Personal income tax allowances?
Oh, sorry, it cut off. Sorry, I heard you. Yes, thank you.
There we go.
Thank you for marking allowances and credits. So there are tax incentives for investment. Pay to boost spending money.
Does CIT include from extractive industries? That's a good question. I actually think that probably depends largely on the specific country. It could. Gabriel, in your country, were there measures that were corporate income tax related that targeted extractive industry? Don't know. That's fine.
Fair.
Fair. Yeah, I mean, I put a few stars up here from the experience that, Kayla and I lived through in our respective countries. One of the biggest things I think that we saw were, enhanced personal income tax allowances and credits. So for example, there was a child tax credit that was issued during COVID that provided an extra credit per child up to a certain number of children. And this was an automatic increase in people's take-home incomes. It actually lifted millions of children out of poverty that were previously living below the poverty line. So it's actually one of those policies that, although instituted during the COVID time period, has actually really lingered in public debate ever since. And although it's lapsed, people are talking about whether it should come back because it had such a powerful result of lifting so many, underaged people out of poverty.
And also to add, for that also an impact on the education system as well. So we know it's like, especially during lockdowns or even, I think the conversation continues, especially when we think about, at least here in the US, when we think about summer time, kids are home and they're not receiving the same same amount of services as during school time. So
Yeah.
highlight that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other example I would mention, and I know a few people have also circled this, these tax incentives for investment. I think certainly, one of the big programs, actually, this is more of an expenditure side thing, but yes, tax incentives for investment. Absolutely. It seems like that's been really common to the experience across this training group. Thanks, Kayla.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. Wonderful. So we'll move right along. That. Okay. All right. So this really concludes our discussion on DRM. Again, for a few key takeaways. First, DRM does create fiscal space for sustainable budgeting through efficient revenue mobilization from many diverse sources beyond taxes, as we talked about. This is key to fostering fiscal autonomy and empowers governments to provide essential public services and fight poverty. Tax administration, regardless of its organizational structure, does play a critical role in collecting the right amount of taxes from the right taxpayers and at the right time, and all of this at minimal cost. So government should focus on three key pillars, really. So that's about enabling and enhancing voluntary compliance, monitoring voluntary compliance, and enforcing that compliance. And then lastly, DRM plays a huge role in building resilient fiscal futures. So by harnessing the potential of domestic resources, fostering a culture of compliance, and exploring innovative technologies, countries can navigate financial challenges effectively and build a future that is both economically and financially resilient. Now, again, we'll just take a quick moment for if anybody has any questions at this time. And thank you. I saw those questions in the chat as well. Thank you, Catherine, for chiming in. Yeah. All right. So moving along, again, we have references linked at the end of each session. In case anybody is also joining us at this time, they are linked at the end of each session. Okay, so this concludes session 3, which brings us to a nice, well-deserved break. We'll be taking a 10-minute pause. So if you need to grab a snack or just stretch, whatever you need, feel free to do that now. But please make sure you return on time. So that'll put us at 3:45. Let's just do, or well, sorry, 3:45 our time.
It is very early for
It is
those of
very
you that
early
just
our
joined
time.
for us. We're in
Yes.
DC.
Yes, so the 45 mark. 45
Okay,
minute mark
it'll
for you.
be 10:45 for
10:45.
South African time.
Lovely.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Yes. So go ahead and please enjoy your break and we'll resume shortly.
Kayla, should we give it one more minute?
Yeah, I think 1 more minute's good. Just allow, if you can hear us, allow your time to come back. And then we'll resume in a minute.
We are back. Is everyone back? Can you just raise a hand or something to indicate if you're back?
Yeah, do like a thumbs up, heart.
Or
Yeah.
thumbs up. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and continue. Okay, so welcome to session 4. Here we're going to talk about the budget preparation process and how the budget is used as a strategic policy tool. In this session, we'll talk more specifically about the important role that budgeting plays in shaping government policies and priorities, because we all know that the budget is one of the most powerful tools for allocating resources effectively and achieving policy objectives. Oops, skipped a little part there. So we have for, our agenda for this session. First, we'll discuss what is a budget. Specifically, we'll talk about the fundamental concept of a budget to understand what it is and its significance in the context of PFM. Then we'll explore the different stages of the budget cycle. And then next, we'll talk about the essential inputs into budget planning and preparation process. Then after that, we'll discuss the different types of budgeting and budget targeting. And then lastly, we'll reflect on budgeting during COVID-19 and how budgeting shifts during those times of crisis. So before we get into the information, let's look at our framework again. So here you can see that budget planning and preparation is one of the key elements of PFM. This is an important phase in the budget cycle because this is where high-level government strategic and sectoral priorities are translated into fiscal policy and resource allocation. And then specifically in this session, we're going to talk about the critical components of budget planning and preparation, as I said. And so really it's important to be aware that good budget preparation relies on a credible medium-term fiscal framework. And in other words, we really want to understand and ensure that the budget is realistic, achievable, and in line with the government's long-term goals. So there are also some modern budget practices, including performance-based budgeting that we'll discuss later. So, but overall, budget planning and preparation is important in order for governments to make informed decisions about resource allocation and obtain the desired results. That's the main point here. So now that we've covered that, we'll look at our objectives for this session. So by the end of the session, you should be able to describe the components of a budget and its role in enhancing institutional performance. This is where we're going to talk about those various components of a budget. And then next, you'll be able to not only explain the budget cycle, but also talk about its different stages. And this understanding will be really helpful for budget management purposes. And then next, you'll become familiar with the various types of budgets. And here we'll discuss the different budgeting approaches and their applications. And then you'll become familiar with budget targeting and examples like gender responsive budgeting. And then lastly, you'll be able to talk about and describe various expenditure responses during crises like COVID-19, which we've been talking about. Okay, so let's move on to these concepts in more detail.
Great, thanks, Kayla. So what exactly is a budget? A budget is essentially an estimation of both revenue and expenses over a specified period of time that is periodically reevaluated. Importantly, budgets aren't just limited to national governments, they really apply to all levels of government. And to put this a little more into perspective, we can think about our own household budget. You compare the money that you expect to receive with what you plan to spend during a specific period of time. For households, that's usually a month time horizon. And in a similar way, national budgets serve the same fundamental purpose. And while budgets can take various forms and approaches, at the very least, a budget should outline how the government intends to utilize its resources throughout the year. And to be meaningful, a good budget should not simply just list planned expenditures, but it should contain sufficient detail and information to enable government officials to discuss whether the expenditures are realistic and appropriate. And the budget should ultimately provide this adequate level of detail as a way of holding governments accountable to those intended expenditures. And as such, a well-constructed budget should include the following key elements. A budget should articulate how the government plans to generate the necessary funds, either through revenues or borrowing. We talked about the revenue side of this in the previous session. Two, the budget should communicate how the government intends to serve its citizens and the ways in which its expenditures will contribute to a better future for those citizens. And lastly, the budget should communicate how the government expenditures will align to the national strategic priorities and the objectives of the various MDAs. In essence, budgeting is the cornerstone of trust between the state and its citizens. It provides that necessary level of transparency and accountability as it outlines the government's financial plans and ensures that the public funds are allocated in order to achieve essential goals and priorities. Next slide. So this graphic might look familiar to some people, maybe many of you, but this is the budget cycle. And the budget cycle is a pivotal process in PFM that ensures effective allocation and utilization of government resources. And it can be divided up into 4 primary stages: budget planning, budget approval, budget execution, and budget oversight. And all 4 of these stages are underpinned by the country's specific legal framework. And they're underpinned by various reporting requirements that take place throughout each of these stages. And we'll walk quickly through these stages to give you a brief description. Budget planning and preparation. This is the first stage, and this is where the government aligns strategic plans with its available resources to create and debate the budget. At this stage, the Ministry of Finance articulates the government's financial plan for the year and outlines how resources will be allocated to meet ongoing operations and program needs. And this stage also includes gathering important input from core sectors, including the private sector and the public at large. Then we move to budget approval, and this happens usually during the last quarter of the financial year when the legislature reviews and approves, hopefully, the budget. Which then authorizes the MDAs to spend their approved funds. Third is budget execution. And in this stage, government policies are implemented and the plans are set in motion. Goods and services and works are procured to achieve program objectives as outlined in the budget and the strategic planning documents. And lastly, budget oversight. And this is a crucial component to ensure that funds are legally expended and that government policies effectively and efficiently achieve their objectives. And then during this stage, activities like audits and monitoring and evaluation are really key aspects. And it's important to highlight that this cycle is continuous. It does not end. It's also important to note that the content of this specific session will really just focus on the first 2 stages of the budget cycle. So where the budget is prepared, reviewed, and approved. Our next sessions will cover activities associated with budget execution and fiscal transparency and oversight. So if we dive deeper into those first stages of the budget cycle, we can see that budget planning and preparation is a process that is not only a complex endeavor, but that also involves various stakeholders and many crucial steps. All of which are necessarily mandated by law and regulation. And each of these steps plays a critical role in ensuring a well-structured and effective budget. And it all begins with the development of the macroeconomic framework, which forecasts those essential economic parameters like inflation, economic growth, available revenues, and unemployment, among others. And these forecasts are collectively known as the economic outlook. The economy obviously impacts both the government's revenue base as well as the demand for its services. And such, the economic outlook is then used to help estimate the funding that will be available and the funding that is needed to carry out these essential services. And using these forecasts, the Ministry of Finance, usually through the National Budget Office equivalent, communicates resource limits to the MDAs. And the MDAs take these resource limits and craft their draft budgets within those funding constraints, aligning their programs and objectives with the relevant national and sector level plans. And then these draft budgets undergo iterative discussion and clarification with the Ministry of Finance and/or the National Budget Office. And subsequently, the draft budgets from the MDAs are consolidated into a comprehensive budget for submission to the legislature. The legislative body then reviews, debates, and hopefully ultimately approves the budget. When the budget is not approved or does not pass, the legal framework dictates the course of action that follows. And now we'll talk a little bit about several of the artifacts that are either produced during the budget preparation or that are inputs for budget preparation. And the first of these artifacts are the budget frameworks. A well-structured budget relies on various frameworks to help guide its formulation and execution. And here on the slide, we'll explore a few of those key budget frameworks that governments produce. The first of these is the macroeconomic framework, which we mentioned briefly on the previous slide. This framework provides that economic forecast that we discussed for the short and medium term, and includes crucial economic variables, such as GDP, inflation, unemployment, others. And the macroeconomic framework aims to realistically assess domestic and global economic trends and make forecasts that will impact the national economy. Second, within the fiscal framework, you will find fiscal projections for the medium term. It encompasses the fiscal position, so deficit or surplus. It includes information also on fiscal sustainability as well as fiscal vulnerability. And this framework reflects the government's fiscal policy, which influences how resources are allocated and spent. The third framework is the macro fiscal framework, which extends its horizon to cover expenditures for a 3 to 5 year period. And this framework draws on both the macroeconomic and the fiscal frameworks to provide the best information about the resources on hand under the current legal constraints. And lastly, we have the medium-term expenditure framework. This framework projects broad fiscal aggregates like revenues and expenditures, helping to ensure consistency with macroeconomic forecasts and medium-term policy measures. It's developed based on the macroeconomic framework. It's also developed with regard to the fiscal framework and the National Development Plan, which we'll talk about in a bit, all of which helps align resources to the country's most pivotal strategic goals. And these 4 budget frameworks are vital for shaping the way governments allocate their resources, manage fiscal stability, and plan for the future. Next slide. So here we can take a look at a real-world example to understand how budget frameworks look and work in practice. This is an example of Canada's fiscal framework from 2012, their updated fall fiscal framework, which provides a glimpse into how these frameworks help structure budgetary decisions. As you can see here, how various factors, including things like economic and fiscal developments, revenue effects, program expenses, all influence the budgetary balance. And it's a complex process, but understanding, kind of the dynamics of these frameworks is important to grasp so that you can better understand how these are leveraged in order to craft a government's budget to meet its financial goals. Next slide. Thanks. Another crucial artifact that sets the budget cycle in motion is the famous budget circular. The budget circular provides guidelines and instructions for MDAs. It is issued by the Ministry of Finance or the National Budget Office equivalent. And it is important for the MDAs so that they can develop their respective funding requests. It is crucial to the budget process to ensure, of course, that everybody that is providing inputs to the budget are following the same set of rules. And so to that end, budget circulars should describe several key pieces of information. And I'll talk through a few right now. Firstly, budget circular should discuss the government's priorities. The budget circular should also present laws and policies that govern the budget preparation process so that all MDAs have that for reference. The budget circular should also discuss the responsibilities of the various agencies that oversee the budget process so that they might be able to help individual MDAs as they're putting together their budget submission. The budget circular should also specifically identify the MDAs that need to submit a budget request for the budget. In principle, of course, the government benefits from a single picture of its financial position, and as such, budget coverage should be as broad as possible. The budget circular also includes information that should be included in the MDA's request for funding. So includes information on the estimates of MDA's own revenues, should they include their expenditures, what kinds of assumptions or justifications they should include, amongst other things. The budget circular also presents for MDAs the format of budget preparation, and it includes information on the means through which budget requests should be submitted. For example, should they be submitted through the government's financial management system, or should they be submitted through another form? The budget circular also provides information on how expenditures should be estimated within the budget request. So, for example, a budget circular typically contains information on suggested personnel cost increases. And this is important since personnel costs tend to be the most significant items within any one MDA's budget. The budget circular also provides information on the types of justifications that MDAs should provide in their request. So should they include things like, for example, program evaluations that are done either by their agency or perhaps by an outside group. And lastly, a budget circular should be very explicit on the timing of the budget process. And it should include all key dates and deadlines, such as budget request submissions from MDAs and the due date to the legislature. And some countries issue actually multiple budget circulars for various purposes. A budget circular that is issued at the beginning of the fiscal year might be of more like a policy guidance letter to help MDAs begin their budget planning process, whereas a circular that is issued later in the fiscal year would more likely contain that kind of prescriptive guidance that would help an MDA craft its budget submission. And on the slide, you can see a few screenshots from the US's budget circular, which was issued in August of last year. And for those of you that have ever looked at a United States budget circular, they tend to be incredibly lengthy and comprehensive. So invite you to look at either the US budget circular or the budget circular of the respective countries that you work in to gain the kind of information and insight on the kind of the budget guidance and process for all the MDAs. Next slide. Thanks, Kayla. So another artifact is the budget calendar. MDAs should receive a budget calendar at the beginning of the current fiscal year. And often a budget calendar is specified in legislation. So it's not something that, the Ministry of Finance or the National Budget Office is inventing every year. It's actually mandated in legislation. And here's an example on the slide of, kind of a generic budget calendar. And this provides a step-by-step overview of the budget process and timeline. As you can see, it all begins with this policy guidance letter or circular, which we discussed on the previous slide. And the various stages of this calendar also include moments for discussion of different budget options, issuance of other detailed circulars, deadlines for budget requests and data calls, and so on. And each of these steps plays a critical role in shaping the creation of the budget. The final stage, of course, involves the enactment of the budget by the legislature. And I really can't emphasize enough the importance of the budget calendar. Understanding the specific timeline within each of the countries you work in is essential for effective programming and budget planning and preparation. So get familiar with your respective country's budget calendar. Thanks, Kayla. So another key artifact that is not produced by the budget cycle, but certainly is a critical input for the budget process, is the country's development plan. And the National Development Plan is a strategic plan that identifies a long-term vision and the necessary steps to meet its targets. It describes how the country sees itself, usually in a 10-year time horizon, but sometimes less than that, depending on the country. And these strategic planning documents express the national priorities and policies that demonstrate how the country plans to progress towards that vision. Ideally, the programs and priorities of all government MDAs should be aligned with the national policies and priorities and contribute to achieving that national vision. Ultimately, the budget itself should be an aggregation of the plans and priorities and should really describe what the government plans to deliver and how much it will cost. And the images that we have on the slide represent just some of the national development plans from the African region. And I know that we have Liberia, we have Nigeria, Rwanda, Zambia, and I know that we have some people that work in those countries today on this call, so that's great. So I encourage you, if you are not yet familiar with your country's national development plan or strategy, I highly encourage you to look yours up and get comfortable and aware of its priorities, its plans, and how it links to the different sectors that you work in. Next slide. Great, thanks, Kayla. So now we want to understand how the budget, so now that we really have an understanding, a crisp understanding of how the budget is put together, we wanted to talk a little bit about the various budgeting types that governments employ and that you, as people that work in PFM, might encounter as you work within your respective countries. And first, one type of budget is the line item budget. And the line item budget is simply a list of each MDA's revenue sources and each type of item that will be purchased during the fiscal year. So for example, things like travel expenses, telecommunication, etc. And the line item budget has historically been the most widely used budget approach because it is relatively easy to prepare and requires limited financial skills. The simplicity of the approach also allows for management officials to easily monitor revenue and expenditures. However, the major deficiency of line item budgeting is the difficulty in determining the actual results generated from the resources expended. It also is difficult to establish crisp priorities and determine the quantity or quality of services which should be generated at various levels of expenditure. The next budget type that you might encounter is the program budget, which provides the MDAs with an opportunity to identify the total cost of each program and then set spending limits and priorities. Program budgeting shifts away from how money is spent to actually considering how money was spent and what was achieved with those funds. So if you think about it, this is a profoundly different orientation from the line item budget that we discussed above. The one downside here, however, is that programs tend to overlap within and across MDAs, which can make allocating resources and collecting data on those programs difficult, and certainly requires some structured interventions to ensure that data is of high quality for decision makers that would use this budget data. And a third type of budget you might encounter is the performance budget, which similarly reflects the budget of each program, like in the program budget we discussed above, but also incorporates key performance information. So think outputs, outcomes, and efficiency measures. And in the performance budget, specific goals and objectives are tied to expenditures for each program. And the focus is therefore on what will be accomplished with the resources provided. And performance budgets typically provide an advantage in the design and implementation of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms for projects by setting those initial parameters and metrics against which success is measured. The downside of performance budgeting, though, is that it's considerably resource intensive to not only develop reliable metrics, but also requires really strong skill sets by all the individuals that are tracking those metrics over time and using that information to inform budget decisions. Lastly, another type of budget that you might encounter is the zero-based budget. A zero-based budget actually wipes the slate clean and requires that all MDAs justify funding for their programs for each fiscal year. A zero-based budgeting approach can be applied to any of the approaches mentioned above. But here, budgets are established based on what is actually needed for the upcoming fiscal year, regardless of whether the budget was higher or lower in previous years. And under zero-based budgeting, the MDAs must reflect on the various levels of service which could be provided with different levels of funding. So as such, a zero-based budget would include a justification document that would reflect the effects of various funding levels. For example, what would be the justification for maintaining the current level of funding? Or what would be the justification for reducing the level of funding by a certain percentage? Or alternatively, what would be the justification for increasing that level of funding by X percentage? A downside to zero-based budgeting is that it is very resource intensive to implement, and as a result is rarely used. It can also have a negative effect on the continuation of some critical programs and their funding if there are not effective controls in place to guard against those kinds of radical shifts. And these different budget approaches that we've discussed, offer flexibility to allow governments to align their budgets to, align their budget process to the specific needs, goals, and priorities that they might have. And while we've listed them separately on this slide, these budgeting approaches actually do reflect an advancing level of maturity and complexity within the budgeting process. Each of these approaches actually serves as building blocks for the successive level. So the line item budget, for example, provides a platform on which other budgeting approaches are built. And certainly, as I've mentioned, while line item budgeting was widely used in the past, we have seen a greater shift in contemporary budgeting towards more emphasis on program and performance-oriented approaches to budgeting. So now let's explore some examples of other emerging common practices that align more with this performance-oriented approach to budgeting, which we've been seeing over the last several decades. So budget targeting is a practice that can be used to help governments set specific goals to achieve specific priority sector-related objectives and understand how their budget allocations are aligned with these goals. A great example of a budget targeting approach that is gaining considerable momentum globally is gender-responsive budgeting. Gender-responsive budgeting is a method of planning and programming and budgeting that helps advance gender equality and women's rights. I do want to be clear that it is not about creating separate budgets for women or solely increasing spending on women's programs. Rather, it seeks to ensure that the collection and allocation of public resources is carried out in ways that are effective and contribute to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. And that hopefully is an objective that is aligned in some form or fashion with all of our country's national development strategies. However, gender responsive budgeting initiatives, can be not only can be carried out at the national level, but they can also be carried out at any level of government. And gender responsive budgeting can encompass approaches that look at the whole budget, or it can include an approach that only looks at selected parts of the budget. So there's a lot of flexibility and variation in gender responsive budgeting practices across the countries that implement it. And excuse me. Like I said, practices of this nature have been helpful in promoting more equitable resource allocation and fostering gender equality. However, the practices are still very much evolving. According to data that we found reported by 105 countries for the period of 2018 to 2021, the status of gender responsive budgeting really does vary considerably worldwide. This study found that only 26% of countries really do have in place a comprehensive system to help track public allocations for gender equality. The study also found that about 60% of those 105 countries have at least some features of a system that would allow them to track public allocation on gender equality. However, they did find that 15% of countries do not even have the minimum elements of such a system. So even as countries globally are at different stages of leveraging practices like gender responsive budgeting, these practices have been recently touted by very important stakeholders in the PFM space, like PIFA, as a valuable practice. In fact, in recent years, PIFA has introduced 9 additional gender responsive public financial management indicators that help assess the extent to which a country's PFM system addresses gender-related goals and promotes gender equality. And these indicators, much like all the other PIFA assessments, can be applied either at the national level or at the subnational level. And the gender responsive PFM assessment from PIFA is intended to be conducted on a voluntary basis in conjunction with the standard PIFA assessment. And when it is completed, the gender responsive PFM assessment is presented as an annex to that PIFA report. And the gender responsive PIFA indicators are designed largely in the form of questions, which are then mapped to the relevant PIFA indicators across the budget cycle. And they assess things like, for example, the presence of a gender impact analysis as part of the budget policy proposals, or the extent of integration of gender into public investment management, as well as 7 other key areas. I won't go through them all for the sake of time, but you can see them presented on the slide. These indicators help us assess how a country's PFM system contributes to addressing the diverse needs of men, women, and various subgroups. Gender equality is a vital aspect of any comprehensive PFM system insofar as it provides more information to help us better understand the operational and allocative efficiency of our PFM systems, which, if you remember from our second session, are 2 of the 3 primary objectives of PFM.
And Catherine, I just wanted to call a question in the chat. Yes, Gabriel asked, can this budget gender lens be used in other population demographics such as disabilities? Sometimes I found that when we talk about gender, we still ignore that there are women with disabilities that need to be considered.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's an awesome question. And the short answer is yes. Budget targeting as a practice can be applied to many different lenses, where a country might have a specific priority policy that they would like to implement. Over the last 2 decades, or not even 2 decades, I would say over the last almost 10 years, gender responsive budgeting has become a big impetus, I think largely driven by the UN's SDGs and a lot of their goals around allocating resources for ensuring equal opportunity and improving outcomes for girls and women. But certainly, this kind of budget targeting approach can be leveraged to target other key populations. People living with disabilities is a great example. Another example would be for if there are some notable ethnic or racially diverse minorities within a country, there could be some budget targeting that seeks to understand how the budget and resources are used to help empower those communities as well, and how well their needs are integrated into the budget system. In one of the subsequent modules, we're actually going to talk about another budget targeting approach, which is called green budgeting. And it looks very much like gender budgeting, but the theme is not gender. The theme is not racially and ethnically diverse subgroups. It is not disabilities. It is green expenditure. Gender responsive budgeting is only, but I would say, one flavor of how this kind of practice can be applied. So Gabriel, did that answer your question? We can go into it in more detail. Great, thanks, Gabriel. Awesome. Next slide. Okay, cool. So now let's explore a case study from Jordan, which highlights the country's journey towards implementing their own results-oriented budgeting approach. And Jordan is a country that is very near and dear to my heart because I worked there for a long time. So in 2008, Jordan embarked on a series of ambitious budget reforms, which marked a significant departure from their input-only budgeting to a multi-year results-oriented budgeting framework. And the core objective of these reforms was to enhance the connection between budget inputs and programmatic outputs and outcomes. And as part of this transformative process, the National Budget Office structured the budget around budget programs led by their various MDAs. And within each program, there was, so each budget program consisted of a set of budget estimates, which included not just the base year, but 3 subsequent out years. Each budget program also included specific program objectives, as well as performance indicators with corresponding targets, which were regularly monitored, usually on a quarterly basis. And furthermore, the results from the previous years were also integrated into the budget documents to help show the progress on those objectives. The National Budget Office also set up a system to help manage and analyze the new performance data that was being generated by their specific budget programs. And later reforms, which started around 2016, sought to extend this approach to help align the various budget programs more closely with the policy priorities within Jordan's national development strategy, as well as to introduce practices like gender-based budgeting. Additionally, at the end of each year, the government had started to publish an annual report, which was showcasing the results of their performance indicators. And one critical success factor of this reform process that I would like to highlight here was the really heavy investment in strengthening the skills of the various budget analysts from the National Budget Office to improve their comprehension of non-financial aspects of their budget programs that they monitor through things like developing quarterly performance reports and conducting quarterly performance reviews with their respective MDAs in their portfolio. And while continuous reforms and improvements are essential, Jordan's efforts to transition towards a more results-oriented budgeting approach has allowed them to correlate their expected performance levels with associated funding. And this alignment has laid the foundation for enhanced accountability going forward.
Thank you, Catherine. So again, returning to our concept here of how all of this applies with COVID-19. So we really want to kind of ground and anchor in this real life application. So as we mentioned before, the pandemic definitely required immediate responses and adjustments to budgets and fiscal policies to address both the health crisis and its socioeconomic impacts. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about how budget planning and preparation has changed and also adapted during COVID-19, and that also provides us with some key lessons learned. So here on this graph, I think it provides a good snapshot of several countries' fiscal responses during COVID-19. The countries that are listed along the x-axis, that horizontal line, and then on the y-axis, that represents the share of GDP, which indicates each country's economic output for addressing the pandemic. So for one example, we can see that countries like Italy and Japan allotted a significant share of their GDP, which was around 45% to combat the effects of COVID-19. And then in contrast, we see some other countries such as Mexico and Nigeria that allocated a lower share, around 2% of their GDP. But it's also important that you can notice here how there's a significant difference between high income and low income countries as well in their allocation of resources. So high income countries generally allocated a larger portion of their GDP, while lower income countries had more limited fiscal capacity to respond. And so overall, this graph is a good representation of how various governments responded with their fiscal policies in that time of such global adversity. And then one of the key tools that governments leveraged when responding to global crises in general, not just COVID-19, is the passage of a supplemental budget. And a supplemental budget is a formal process used to approve changes to the budget and also allocate additional funds. And this process is essential when there are circumstances that require adjustments to the original budget. So some of these circumstances can include one being new programs. When a new program or initiative needs funding, they may not have been already included in the original budget. And then we also have greater expenditures than expected. So sometimes there are certain expenses that exceed the budgeted amounts, and then we need additional funds that are needed to cover those costs. There's also inflation. So inflation can impact the purchasing power of allocated funds. So supplemental budget allocations are really needed to maintain that same level of services provided by most governments. And then lastly, another circumstance we have is covering shortfalls in revenue collection. So if revenue collection falls short of budget projections, a supplemental budget can be used to compensate for any of those deficiencies. And then in some cases, changes to the budget can actually occur without legislative approval, which we can also see here in the couple examples we have here with South Sudan and Nepal. So in South Sudan, the government can transfer up to 10% of a budgeted amount from one line item to another by notifying the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. And then we also see in Nepal, they have a policy that allows budget transfers within a program. And this is up to 25% of flexibility that they have there to move funds between those line items. However, the funds cannot be shifted in this case out of certain categories like salaries, capital subsidies, furniture, transport, machinery, and tools, and others. And then for changes that are falling outside of these circumstances, or when additional funds are required, the government follows a formal process. So this can involve like issuing a budget circular, like what we talked about, that outlines the changes and the reasons behind them. And it also follows a specific calendar, like we also talked about earlier. So this would then be considered a revised budget at this point, and that is submitted to the legislature for formal approval. And supplemental budgets really do play a key role in ensuring that government finances remain both flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. Because really, sometimes we just have no way of predicting what's going to come up. So they really help governments respond effectively to new challenges and provide the resources needed to meet constantly evolving priorities. And really making changes through the legislative approval process is essential for also maintaining transparency and accountability in budget management. Okay, so so now that we've talked about supplemental budgets, we do know that governments around the world respond in various ways, like we talked about specifically to COVID-19. And governments did do this what we saw by increasing cash transfers, increasing access to liquidity. These are included like loans. They provided temporary debt relief, provided subsidies for rent, food, transportation, also had unemployment support. Governments we also saw provided low or no cost access to vaccines and issued new tax credits like we talked about as well as other initiatives. So at this time, we really want to know and get a better understanding of the types of support that your country provided during the pandemic. And so if you can use the annotate feature like we've been using during this training, you can, again, just feel free to circle or stamp that type of support that your country provided. And if you joined us a little bit later, again, you'll see the annotate function at the top of your screen. It'll pop out another one after you select that on the left-hand side and where you can select either the pen or a stamp. So we've got cash, loans, debt relief, unemployment support, food assistance. I like the heart. Very essential. Tax credits, right? transportation, especially to and from, to receive a lot of those other services listed here. And rental assistance, yes, healthcare, 100%. Education, healthcare, another healthcare, yeah. I know, like we talked about some of these things earlier as well, but I think they're all really interconnected and related, and sort of like, you know, if we give assistance to one, it automatically feeds and impacts the others. So, wonderful.
I think that one of the other interesting things about all of these approaches, and I mean, as you can see from, you know, just the contributions here, there's really a wide range of things that countries did to support their populations. But I do feel like there's not a single person, you know, on this call that hasn't been affected or touched in some way by these various, you know, expenditure measures that our various governments took to help, you know, cushion us from the economic and societal impacts of this pandemic. And I think that that's, you know, and of course, you know, like Kayla said, these are all very unforeseen things. Whoever would have thought in 2019 that we would have spent virtually 2 years in some form of lockdown, and with this concern of, you know, a raging pandemic. And I think that the ability of all of our collective countries to respond quickly and with this kind of diverse portfolio of support, you know, speaks volumes to kind of how far I would say PFM systems have come over the last, you know, 20, 30 years, and really just underpins the necessity of a strong financial management system.
100%. And let's see, Christopher said, great presentation and very informative information been discussed in this training, but my question is, will these training materials be sent to the participants? Absolutely, yes. Wonderful. Thank you. And yeah, and I wanted to also add on to that, is that I think from what, at least what I observed as well during that time, is by having these supplemental budgets allowing these types of support, I think it really pushed different countries and governments to think even how some of these supports and measures can be expanded in ways that we hadn't obviously had to deal with previously.
Yeah. Is there
Yeah.
anything in particular that comes to mind, Kayla?
Well, my mind is still on the tax credits for children. I have two
Oh.
kids, so
Yeah, so that was helpful for you. Yeah.
that was
I guess
helpful for me.
the other thing that I would say about that is the debt relief aspect. At least in our experience from the United States, one of the major features of the US's response was that they froze payments for student loans, which, if any of you are familiar with the US higher education system, it's incredibly costly. And over the last 20, 30 years, students have incurred increasingly large volumes of debt that far outpace inflation to be able to educate themselves. And so in, you know, at the onset of the pandemic, the government froze tax, froze payment on student loans, and also froze interest. So interest would not be accrued. People did not owe money. And those payments only just recently resumed last September, Kayla, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So 2023. So from 2020 to 2023, people did not have to pay their student loans, so that they could focus their liquidity on other critical expenditures. And as a result, that has really revived and given a lot of new life to a debate on what is the appropriate debt level for students to begin with, and do we need to do more to minimize that debt burden for our young people that want to educate themselves and contribute to society with that education.
Yeah, definitely. And I was also looking at transportation and healthcare in general, because just increasing access to not only vaccines, but just testing. We saw a lot of sort of like pop-up testing areas. Some were drive-through, so you didn't even have to get out of your car, but also being able to even just help people get to those locations. So we know, especially healthcare workers in general, were stretched incredibly thin. So having these pockets and help with transportation, even getting there to get those services was really instrumental. I know in especially a lot of inner cities.
Yeah. Yeah, and beyond many governments subsidizing the cost of the vaccines themselves, in the United States, the government provided an incredible amount of grant money to different pharmaceuticals and to the National Health Institute to develop a vaccine to begin with. I would say recovery and weathering the COVID-19 pandemic was very much a government-led effort that required, a multifaceted approach, both on the revenue and the expenditure side, and a range of stakeholders all across the PFM system, which we've been talking. Over to you, Kayla.
Yes, thank you. All right, so wrapping up that conversation, we will move forward. Let me just remove these. Okay. So coming to our conclusion of the session, really we want to highlight again that budgets articulate how governments plan to raise funds, allocate resources, and contribute to a better future while also supporting national priorities. The budget cycle is a complex process, as we know, because it involves multiple stakeholders from a macroeconomic framework development to all the way to legislative approval. And it involves a detailed and rigorous review as well. We also learned that different countries employ various types of budgeting approaches, such as line item, program-based, performance-based, and zero-based budgets. Each of them, of course, have their own unique advantages and limitations. But lastly, we know now that in times of global crises, budgets are really subject to significant modifications. The amount of emergency expenditures increases as countries respond quickly by passing supplemental budgets. So now, especially if you have any last questions or if you have any thoughts or insights you'd like to share, we'd be happy to hear them and also answer. And also, I know this is the first day. It's a lot of information to absorb and things. And I know I take a lot of time to process. So especially if you take time to reflect over the night and tomorrow, if you want to ask any other questions pertaining to this training as well, please don't feel limited.
Gabriel has a question. In our context where the majority of people are in an informal economy, they may not appear getting financial support. Most of the support went to those affected in the formal sector. That is a great observation. Yes, and that is why targeting of interventions is absolutely critical. And clearly the like tax credit interventions are much less effective for those in the informal sector than for those in the formal sector. In those kinds of situations where there's a very heavy portion of society that pertains to the informal sector, who by and large tend to be, groups of people that are more vulnerable to these kinds of dramatic, kinds of shifts in the economy, or the interventions need to be profoundly different. And in those kinds of situations, things like cash transfer programs tend to be more effective because historically they're better at targeting populations that are, underrepresented, less served, harder to reach. because they're obviously not doing things like paying taxes. Well, maybe they are, but they might not be. Or you can also have interventions that target schools. Even if you are in in the informal economy, you may be sending your child to a school where they could be receiving your child or the family could be receiving specific services and support from the government. Healthcare facilities also in those communities are also critical instruments for reaching those populations that might otherwise feel a little bit out of reach for some of those policy measures like tax credits or debt relief, etc. Gabriel, I don't know if you want to come off mute or add anything more into the chat, but do you have any examples of approaches that you've seen from your own experience that took into account the heavy existence of an informal economy and needing to target people that are in that sector?
No, actually, well, no, not really. That I can think about, but mostly it was, I saw those vulnerable groups that we are targeting in the health sector, like Polish showmakers, sex workers, all these petty trading that were prevented, like going out for their business. I mean, but no alternative measures were left for them in terms of livelihoods to gain or to feed their own families. So because there was no tourism, for instance, all the hotels closed, and a Polish shoe person who sits at the entrance of a hotel from polishing like 200 pairs of shoes per day went to 10 or 5. So that's a huge loss of income.
Huge.
Taxi drivers, all these aspects. When you have a very big informal economy, I mean, COVID was a big, huge trouble.
Yeah, it was huge.
Because these people, although the government put in place, I mean, loans and everything for you to get the all documentation, apply for an application will be 20, 30 pages of well-documented. So it's very difficult for those low or vulnerable population. Over.
Yeah, no, the barriers are huge. And Gabriel, you mentioned, and this is just a really good perennial problem that you've highlighted. How do we reach the people that need the most help when they are, either the least likely to be able to access, or there's so many barriers in their way. And I think that this also goes to some of those policy trade-offs that countries think through when they're confronted with a situation like this. Kayla, could you actually go back to the slide where we have the various countries' COVID responses by percentage of GDP? Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this slide that we didn't necessarily highlight for time's perspective, but Gabriel's comment actually made me think about it. If you look, obviously Kayla mentioned that in general, high-income countries spent quite a bit of their share of GDP on COVID response, and the lower income you are in terms of a country, the the less you tend to spend as a share of your GDP. There's a very notable exception here, and that is Mexico. Mexico is it's a higher middle income country, but it's also an OECD member. So it's one of the 20 largest economies in the world. And they only spent a cool 2% of their GDP on COVID response. And part of their calculus, Gabriel, was exactly what you just mentioned. Mexico has an incredibly large informal economy that really drives the consumption culture of their country, which propels economic growth. And Mexico never shut down. Or if they did, their shutdowns were incredibly targeted. And as a result, like Mexican markets kept moving, like the hustle and bustle kept on going. Of course, this, I think, was at the expense of, raging pandemic numbers that were really out of control. They could not control the contagion. And I don't really think Mexico ever really had a robust public health policy, but they, as a country, as a government, seemed to be more interested in managing the economic fallout of what would happen if they forced government or country closure than in doing the work of, managing the raging pandemic. And those are policy decisions. I don't necessarily agree with them, but the conversation that we're having makes me, obviously I appreciate that dilemma quite a bit. And here we can see an example where our country flatly said, we are, closing down your country requires a considerable investment in fiscal response. And as you can see here, Mexico was like, we're not doing that. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's an interesting contrast that even within countries of a similar economic level, there are still wide variety of policy responses and different policy calculus that come into play when making those trade-off decisions, for better or for worse. Okay, sorry, Kayla, back over to you.
No, great. Thank you. Yeah, I was also picking in my head. I see a thumbs up, Gabriel. Wonderful. Thank you for that. So I know we're coming to the end of our session. So again, we just want to remind everybody that there are resources here, links from for all the topics that we discussed today. And that really this concludes the end of session 4 and actually the end of day 1 for our training. So we really thank you all for your active participation and your questions. And tomorrow we'll begin with session 5, which talks about providing goods and services through budget execution. And then we really hope that you have a good rest of your day. But I see a link, please. Did you have a specific link? Yeah, I didn't see the link.
Oh, to the resources?
Yeah, to the resources.
Yeah. You can go back to the next slide, Kayla. They're all embedded in the presentation.
Oops.
Yeah, so there's a reference slide at the back of each session that have our references linked for everybody.
Yeah.
So when you get this deck, you'll be able to access all of these resources and more.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Sharon or anyone from FPD, do we have any other last announcements before we adjourn for the day?
Yes, I would like to remind everyone of the pre-test that was sent to you. Can you please do it if you haven't submitted already?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you guys tomorrow, bright and early.
Bye.
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 Obrigado. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.